Down through the years, people have covered for religious leaders, even when they knew those leaders had predatory patterns and behaviors. And I'm not just talking about inappropriate behavior, I'm talking about manipulation, exploitation, financial abuse, emotional control, spiritual intimidation, and the kind of psychological grooming that makes people doubt what they innately know. Predatory behaviors are cloaked. It wears many faces, and what I know from personal experience to be true is that they often hide in religious spaces behind the faces and the performances of the ones most respected. That's when the shepherd becomes the wolf. Hey everybody, this is your girl Coach G, your transformational coach with a master's in psychology and a PhD in life. And we're continuing our PTSD series where we're talking about patterns and traditions that we've learned, the survival and the deliverance we so desperately need. In today's topic of discussion, when the shepherd becomes the wolf, I want us to really get honest. This is a topic that many people would rather sweep under the rug. They don't want to face it. They'd rather put their hands over their ears and stone the messenger, just like they did Stephen. Why? Because the religious leaders accused him of blasphemy. A classic case of manipulation when they don't want people to learn how they've been tricked, how their minds have been twisted into believing something that biblically is not true. But at some point in this thing called life, you have to decide whether you're going to face the truth and call a spade, or keep pretending everything is good, making excuses for bad behavior, and convincing yourself that all you experienced was a figment of your imagination. And that is classic Stockholm Syndrome, which is a psychological survival response. You know the person is predatory. You know they're harming you, but you continue to protect them. You continue to say, that's not what they meant. That emotional attachment you've developed causes you to be loyal to a fault. And not only loyal to a fault, you'll get angry when someone tries to show you how that person is hurting you. But you have to tell the truth anyway. Be honest with yourself about the pain and the scars you're hiding and what you had to survive just to still be here on this earth. People often protect predatory leaders because of these complex mixtures of psychological and social uh, forces. And cognitive dissonance plays a major role in this. Understandably, recognizing that a leader is harmful can clash with the idea that the church is supposed to be this sacred and safe space. It causes an emotional conflict that makes you ignore harm instead of facing it. Since religious leaders are often seen as these moral guides who are representatives of God, it increases that authority. And do you trust them without question? Do you overlook anything that they do? Any evidence that contradicts? that positive image that they've shown you, that they put forth, that's not being honest. That's not being honest with yourself. That's not protecting you. And sadly, because you fear losing friendships or maybe even your sense of identity, you close your eyes, you keep quiet. You worry about being labeled as a troublemaker, and it's understandable. Nobody wants to face that type of retaliation, especially when it's the only place you feel you truly belong. Plus, there is this mindset in the church that you have to protect the leaders and the church's reputation because somebody, their title, their name, their position is more important than caring for the people inside that building. And the more this happens over time, when behaviors uh, like this continue, we stop feeling like it's abuse. And it just becomes how things are. This is just the way they are. This is just the way it happens. It's nothing meant by, right? There is this culture of silence that is fostered, an acceptance that doesn't just hide harm, but it increases it. Why would you want that type of weight on your shoulders? When I sit and talk with those many beautiful souls, people who bared their hearts, spilled their secrets because they thought they were in a safe space and they thought that who they were talking to was safe. It not just angers me, it breaks me because some of the deepest wounds in the human spirit weren't caused by the world that so many preachers preach against. They were caused instead inside the very walls that were supposed to protect them. And when you've heard enough stories, when you've looked into their eyes, the eyes that once carried faith, but now carry pain and fear, you begin to understand something profoundly uncomfortable. And that is that not every wolf comes with a howl. Some come wearing collars, carrying titles and Bibles, and standing behind the pulpits. They're charismatic, they speak with authority, and they're shielded by a community that has been conditioned to confuse position with purity. What devastates people is not only the misconduct itself, though that alone can shatter a life. What devastates them is the covering that follows, the excuses, the spiritual acrobats people perform to protect the image of a leader while sacrificing the souls of the victims. There was a church that I was in for many years, and there was a preacher that came to town every year to run revivals. Every year, this evangelist came to town, he would always make these little side remarks to me. And I will tell you, it made me very uncomfortable, but I didn't know what to do as it related to talking to someone about it because I never really felt like I was in a safe space. And over time, I eventually left that ministry. And in doing so, that same preacher was invited again as normal to run a revival. But I had become a stronger person. And one particular night during this revival time, it had to be, I believe, around 11 p.m. My phone rings, and we had the little landline phones then. And it woke me up, and I grabbed the phone, as I do. And I said, hello. And the person on the other end was the preacher. And he began to ask me, where was I? Why had not I been to the revival? Well, I had left that ministry. So for me, that just wasn't a thing. So he asked me if I would come to the hotel where he was. And then he began to say all types of uh inappropriate, let's just say it like that, inappropriate things. And I checked him on that. But I decided to go a bit further. And I called the pastor of the ministry and I told them I wanted to have a meeting with this particular uh, evangelist, apostle. And I asked one ask that they not tell him who was coming to the meeting that I had asked for. But instead, not only did they tell them, they told them while the revival was still supposed to be happening. So I am the first person to get to the hotel. And lo and behold, he is standing at the counter checking out. Now, mind you, he was supposed to run the revival through the next night. But because of the way the situation was handled, he thought he would leave that night. And when the pastor of the ministry got there, they pulled out a tape recorder. And I will say I was doubly offended because in my mind, I was thinking, do they not believe me? Do they believe this guy, this pastor, this preacher over me? And this is why I said I never felt safe. Now, whether the pastor believed me or not, I can't necessarily say, but I can tell you this. The next year, that same preacher was invited back to run another revival. I've heard survivors recount the moment they finally spoke up, only to be met with phrases like, nobody's perfect, or he's still or she's still a man or woman of God, or to scare the bejesus out of you, they'd say something like, don't touch the Lord's anointed. Some were even told they just misunderstood, and others, especially females, were labeled as temptress. Others were told, just forget about it, sweep it under the rug, let's table it, let's move on. And every time those words were spoken, another survivor learned the same heartbreaking lesson, that their pain and their experience was less important than a position or a title. And that is how trauma cements itself in us. Not just through the violation, but through the silence and the excuses that follow, through the communities that rallies around the abuser instead of the abused. Through the theology that teaches people to swallow their suffering in the name of loyalty, in the name of unity, and in the name of spiritual maturity. I've talked to people who once loved God with everything in them, but now they can't even say his name without feeling anger and resentment, not because God failed them, but because someone who claimed to represent him and used that claim as a weapon. And when people who harms you is the same people who teaches you about God, the lines get blurred. The trauma fuses itself together, and suddenly God feels like this imaginary, distant, maybe even cruel entity, not because he is, but because the messenger was. And this is where the psychological and spiritual impact becomes undeniable. Psychologically, people began to question their own perception. They wonder if they misread the situation, if maybe they overreacted, if they are the problem, which is what a lot of women in abusive relationships or even men, this is what they do. They start blaming themselves as if somehow it was their fault that they were abused, that they were hit, or that they were talked down to like they were not human, like they didn't have feelings, like they didn't matter. That's the power of spiritual grooming. It teaches you to distrust your own instincts while it elevates the leader's voice above your own. And once that happens, the leader doesn't even have to silence you. You start silencing yourself. You internalize the idea that your discomfort is rebellion, your boundaries are disrespect, and your pain is because of your own disloyalty. Spiritually, the impact cuts even deeper because when people uses God's name to justify their behavior, the wound doesn't stay with the person. It attaches itself to your understanding of who God is. Because why isn't God doing anything, right? Why are people protecting this person? Why are people in the church? Why are dignitaries? Why are our evangelists? Why are all these people protecting this predator? And so it attaches itself to your understanding, like I said, of who God is. And suddenly, prayer even feels unsafe. Worship feels confusing because why pray? Why worship? The scripture even feels weaponized against you. The very things that once grounded you now triggers you. And that's not because you walked away from God. It's because someone contaminated the space where you once met with him. This is why so many people walk away from the church and from God at the same time. Not because they don't believe, not because they're rebellious, but because the trauma fused the messenger with the message, the abuser with the altar, the predator with the presence of God. And when the shepherd becomes the wolf, the sheep don't just run from the wolf, they run from the pastor altogether. And I think a part that gets overlooked is that the misconduct that continually shields itself behind the collar or the Bible or the pulpit doesn't just harm the individuals, it determines how an entire community operates. It creates cultures where silence is seen as humility. It's spiritualized. It's where people demand loyalty and asking questions is demonized. Suffering is normalized. And so people learn to perform healing instead of actually pursuing and being delivered. They learn to shout over all their pain. They learn to camouflage what they really feel. They learn to protect the leader instead of protecting themselves. Spiritual authority was never meant to be a shield for misconduct. Titles were never meant to be hiding places for predators of any kind, whether they're preying on you to get your money, whether they're preying on you to get your sympathy, whether they're preying on you to manipulate your mind. God was never meant to be used as a cover for harm. And when someone uses their position to manipulate, to intimidate, or control, that is not ministry. That is misuse. That is abuse. It's not leadership. It's leveraging and usurping power over people. And that, my friends, is not God. That is grooming. And until we can say that plainly, without fear, without hesitation, without worrying about who gets uncomfortable, people will continue to suffer in silence. They will continue to carry wounds that were never theirs to carry. They will continue to walk away from faith because no one ever separated the character of God from the behavior of the person who claimed to represent him. When the shepherd becomes the wolf, the sheep don't stop needing safety. They just stop believing it exists. And that is why these conversations matter. Not to tear down faith, but to rebuild it on something real, something solid. It's not to shame everybody in the church, but to call it away from Ichabod and call it back to its integrity. What happened to you and others, to me, it was wrong. It was not your fault. And God was not the one who hurt you. And I want you to understand that. And when that truth finally lands, you can begin the work of finding your way back to who you were meant to be, who you were called to be, the purpose that you were called into. That's it. That's all.
Can we do it?
Hey, everybody, this is Coach G. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope that there has been something that was said that has touched your heart and opened your mind, that has given you the boldness to walk in faith, not in fear, to no longer keep silent because you realize now that your voice is your power. And so before you go, I want you to please hit that like button. I want you to share, subscribe so that you don't miss an episode. And please leave your thoughts below. I really do read them. And so now I want you to get out there and I want you to conquer the world. And if not the world, conquer yourself.
Can we do it?